North Korea sounding off after a fresh round of sanctions from the UN Security Council in response to its missile launch late last month. The new sanctions limiting Pyongyang's access to oil and forcing North Korean workers in other countries to return home. The rogue regime calling the sanctions a, quote, act of war and threatening to retaliate against nations who supported them. Joining now is Kieran Skinner, professor of international relations at Carnegie Mellon University, a research fellow at Hoover Institution, and a Fox News foreign policy analyst. Nice to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. You know, North Korea seems to call everything an act of war. Every single time we do joint military exercises with South Korea, North Korea calls it an act of war. So, you know, why does Kim Jong-un do this, and at what point are we going to take it seriously?
Well, the newest sanctions are so dauntingly punitive that I think there's nothing else for the North Korean leader to say. Not only are they punitive, but they are unanimous, with much of the world behind the U.S.-led sanctions resolution. And that further isolates the regime. And it will hurt its economy and the ability of the leadership to continue to develop its nuclear and ballistic missile program. So his rhetoric doesn't compare to the reality of what the world has just done.
You know, North Korea also has vowed that every country that voted in favor of the resolution would face retaliation from North Korea. So presumably that would mean Russia and China. What do you make of that?
North Korea is out of options in terms of retaliation because it attempts to play nuclear blackmail. The problem with using that type of lack of diplomacy, if you will, is that you have no other options below. What can it do to the world but threaten some type of nuclear maneuver that would immediately hurt the Chinese, of which it is attached to territorially. So I think it's just really rhetoric and desperation.
Well, how do you think these sanctions will actually be implemented? Because in the past, the problem is the sanctions haven't been implemented as they were supposed to be by the countries involved.
The fact that we've had numerous now unanimous sanctions resolutions and that the United States is continuing to pressure the great powers that have signed on to the sanctions resolutions like the Chinese and Russians, and given that the fact that the Chinese and Russians are part of the sanctions resolutions, they are the only allies of North Korea, I think speaks to the capacity to get a much more universal compliance with them. But also they hit so many sectors all at the same time that I think their effectiveness will be much superior to ones in the past. Textiles, for example, are now banned. The importing of North Korean textiles. The North Korean workers, more than 90,000, are being recalled home from abroad within 2 years, and they've accounted for additional hard currency for the country. You just go down the list, and I think these sanctions really will work.
That's true, and yet today the AP is reporting that U.S. officials say that, you know, when North Korean coal exports were forbidden, shiploads would basically be channeled through Russia. Sometimes goods and products would be switched from ship to ship out at sea in order to avoid sanctions being implemented.
Yes, there's more ship-to-ship compliance, I think, in the newest round of sanctions because there are ways to check for compliance that didn't exist in the past. But also, the Russians and Chinese simply have much more skin in the game this time because North Korea is so out of control with the development of its nuclear program against prior UN resolutions that the Chinese and North Koreans, the Chinese and the Russians, have really taken notice. They don't want an all-out war. It will be devastating for them in addition to the rest of the world.
Well, I should mention that China actually has a defense agreement with North Korea, so it's sort of to be determined what would happen if North Korea were to get into a military action with another country, including the U.S. But I want to bring this up. You know, there's a thought that Kim Jong-un is absolutely unwilling to give up his nuclear program, that he essentially ties that to his own life and to his own staying in power, that he believes that Colonel Gaddafi would still be in place, that Hussein would still be alive if they had nuclear weapons. What do you say to that ideology, that he simply isn't going to give up his nuclear weapons program?
Yes, he's created this dangerous scenario where his regime survival and his own personal survival is tied to his nuclear program. This is an odd type of nuclear deterrence. The problem is that he's got to be able to continually convince the elites in his own country that the whole country's survival is tied to his survival, which is tied to the nuclear program. If there's any break away from him among elites, those in the military, those in China that he depends on, I think then he's taken a risky gambit, and it may not work.
All right, well, we shall see. Kyron Skinner, thank you for your insight today.
Thank you.
Just breaking moments ago, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in Hawaii proclaiming President Trump's travel ban a violation of federal law, ruling the ban goes beyond his authority as commander-in-chief. However, the appeals court stopped short of blocking that order, instead issuing a stay pending a ruling by the Supreme Court. We're going to keep you posted on any late-breaking details.
Should the North Korean regime conduct another nuclear or ballistic missile test, this resolution commits the Security Council to take even further action. It sends the unambiguous message to Pyongyang that further defiance will invite further punishment and isolation.
That was U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Nikki Haley earlier today after the UN Security Council unanimously voted to impose new sanctions on North Korea in response to the rogue regime's recent ICBM launch. That missile is said to be capable of hitting anywhere in the U.S. Aaron Cohen is a 21-year Israeli-trained security and counterterror veteran and the founder of Aaron Cohen's Soft Target Security Training Systems. So thank you so much for joining us. You know, this is just 24 hours after the UN was down a completely different road, condemning the U.S. Today, stood together, all 15 members, and imposed these new sanctions, including China and Russia. How significant is that?
Well, it's really significant, and it's also ironic how the UN, as soon as their organization is threatened in any way by Pyongyang, like we're seeing here, they flip the script very quickly. But that's neither here nor there. This is very significant. The reason why is because North Korea is attempting, and in fact getting closer to being able to launch a ballistic missile, which can in fact hit our country. That's a very real thing, and so. The president, along with his National Security Council, laid out a security plan that does what you have to do with terrorists. And why do I call this guy a terrorist? Because a terrorist will fire at civilians unprovoked. That's what they do. Yeah. So how do you deal with them? You got to go for the neck. You got to bite down, and you got to make sure that they can't move and that they can't get access to their funding. And so the attack of the finances and by restricting funding to North Korea through very hard sanctions is exactly the security play that's required. So salute to Donald Trump. And I salute the woman who's at the UN making that announcement also. I think she's fabulous, and I think she's no nonsense. Yeah. And I love hearing her put it to the UN. It's absolutely my favorite thing I've been listening to in the last couple of days.
You know, not quite as far as President Trump wanted to go. He wanted to cut off all oil imports. This very dramatically limits them far below where they are right now, where they only had been reduced by about 30%. At this point now, they're almost gone. But he also wanted to have all foreign workers sent back to North Korea from everywhere else that they're working, which generates so much cash for the nation.
That's right. That's right. And by essentially what he's doing is he's creating choke points to the labor. And what that does is it essentially puts everybody on watch, which is, look, if you're going to export something to North Korea, if you're going to export goods there, if you're going to work and bring any kind of expertise back there, whether, you know, as well as the oil, we're going to constrict, even though it's only 30%, like you mentioned, still billion or millions of barrels per day. And so Again, you deal with terrorism. Again, I'm coming from the Israeli perspective here. My unit never went after the low-level terrorists. We went after the management of the guys, the financiers, the money guys. No money, no terror. No millions of barrels exported here. No labor being able to carry out North Korea business. Again, by constricting or putting choke points, you are softening that terrorist.
I
So
don't
good
want to
on
run out of
President
time.
Trump.
I'm glad you brought up terrorism because that is your expertise, and I want to run out of time without asking you about this plot that was uncovered in San Francisco. It was stopped in time. The assailant was posting things on the internet pro-ISIS, but also, was a shooting specialist. He had a lot of training and a very specific plan. How dangerous was this?
Well, he's a former Marine. Marines are dangerous. Marines are trained to kill people for a living. That's why we go to war with them. We train alongside the Marine Corps at our counterterrorist school in Expert. At our counterterror warfare school in Israel. They're extremely lethal, and that's what they're trained to be. They're just like Defense Secretary Mattis. He has a plan when he walks in a room to kill everybody, and that's how well Marines are trained. And you want them in war. They're fine instruments of counterterrorism and urban operations. But in this case, you had a radicalized, again, online, an inbred or an inbreed terrorist that was created here through indoctrination. I don't know exactly what it was, but extremely dangerous guy. Hats off to the FBI for getting the jump on this guy and being able to put him down and getting those warrants in time. We just want to make sure now that our soft target defensive security measures are in place. And I think going into the new year, coming out of this holiday, I wouldn't be surprised if the president is looking at putting together some type of soft target security apparatus to be able to look at this thing.
Aaron Cohen, thank you.
Access to oil and forcing North Korean workers in other countries to return home. The rogue regime calling the sanctions a, quote, act of war and threatening to retaliate against nations who supported them. Joining now is Kieran Skinner, professor of international relations at Carnegie Mellon University. North Korea sounding off after a fresh round of sanctions from the UN Security Council in response to its missile launch late last month. The new sanctions limiting Pyongyang's
North Korean leader to say not only are they punitive, but they are unanimous, with much of the world behind the U.S.-led sanctions resolution. And that further isolates the regime. And it will.
North Korea calls it an act of war. So, why does Kim Jong-un do this, and at what point are we going to take it seriously?
Well, the newest sanctions are so dauntingly punitive that I think there's nothing else for the...
A research fellow at Hoover Institution and a Fox News foreign policy analyst. Nice to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. North Korea seems to call everything an act of war. Every single time we do joint military exercises with South Korea.